They say you can tell everything about a person's character by how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. I have found this to be absolutely, devastatingly true. And the people who mistake that silence for weakness, who mistake that patience for ignorance, who look across a room at a quiet old man in simple clothes and see nothing worth respecting, those are always the most interesting people to watch. My name is Thomas Vance. I am 67 years old, a retired chief engineer of metallurgy and structural track infrastructure for the Atlantic Railway networks. I know exactly how much pressure a single steel rail can sustain before it snaps. I have spent my entire life studying stress points, fractures, and the silent load-bearing limits of heavy iron. People think steel is tough because it's loud when it slams together. They are wrong. The strongest steel is the quietest, absorbing decades of crushing weight without making a single sound, until the day it decides to hold its ground and derail everything running on top of it. It was exactly 5:02 a.m. on Friday, April 11th, 2025, when I sat on the wooden porch of the home I've owned for 34 years on Birchwood Lane, deep in Norfolk County, Massachusetts. The morning was freezing. I was holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, no sugar, watching the heavy Atlantic salt mist settle over the hood of my 2008 Ford F-150. It's dark green, with a rusted rear wheel well and a dented tailgate from a fallen oak branch 10 winters ago. To anyone passing by, it's just a broken-down piece of junk. To me, it's a machine that does exactly what it's built to do. The quiet was broken by the quiet, electric hum of a 6-figure machine. My son-in-law, Richard Miller, pulled his pristine, chalk-white Porsche Taycan into my gravel driveway. He didn't turn off the engine. He stepped out, wearing a flawless, tailored suit, looking like he had crawled straight out of a New England Country Club brochure. He marched up my porch stairs, carrying a thick document bearing the elegant, raised gold leaf logo of a prominent Boston family law firm. Without asking, he slammed the folder down onto the antique oak side table sitting next to my chair, a table my late wife, Martha, had restored with her own hands 40 years ago. Then, with a calculated, careless arrogance, Richard reached down, placed his sweating, cold glass of iced water directly on top of the framed photograph of Martha that always sat on that table, leaving a thick, wet ring right across her face. He didn't look at the photo. He looked down at me, checking his gold Rolex. "We need to formalize some family asset structures, Tom," Richard said, his voice dripping with that polished, corporate condescension I've tolerated for 3 years. "It's a standard post-nuptial adjustment regarding Clara's future inheritance. Sign it. My lawyer's already approved it." He paused, looking out at my driveway, his nose curling in disgust. "And do me a favor, Tom. Hide that rusted green eyesore of a truck behind the barn today, will you? My parents, Charles and Evelyn, are driving down to Westfield for dinner tonight, and that piece of trash is a complete eyesore for the neighborhood." I didn't blink. I didn't reach for the glass to save the photograph. I didn't get mad. I got organized. I looked at the wet ring soaking into the wood, and then I looked into Richard's eyes. Inside my chest, a quiet, watchful part of me smiled. He thought he was looking at an old, helpless, retired laborer with a minimal bank account and a fading mind. He had absolutely no idea he was standing on my tracks, and the train was already moving. Welcome to Dad's ultimate payback. Get settled, because this story is going to take you somewhere you never expected. Do us a quick favor right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment below letting me know exactly where you are watching this from. Trust me, you are going to love it here, because quiet men are only quiet until they're not, and patience is just revenge that hasn't introduced itself yet. But this story doesn't truly begin on that freezing morning in Norfolk County in April 2025. To understand the structural integrity of a trap, you have to go back to the moment the predator first mistook the architect for easy prey. For that, we have to look back exactly 3 years earlier. It was a crisp, clear Thursday evening on May 12, 2022. The location was the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston, hosting an elite annual charity fundraising mixer. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, political networking, and old New England money. I didn't want to be there. I only went because my daughter, Clara, had pleaded with me to meet the new man in her life. I arrived wearing a charcoal blazer that had seen better decades, a plain white button-down, and a pair of sensibly polished leather shoes. I didn't fit the scenery. and that was entirely by design. I took up a strategic position at the far back of the ballroom, standing right by the prime rib carving station, because that is where the real, unpretentious people gather at these events. I was quietly nursing a club soda with a twist of lime, keeping to myself, when Richard Miller targeted my daughter. I watched them from across the crowded room. Richard was in his absolute element, holding a glass of scotch, laughing just a fraction too loudly, and aggressively working the floor. Within 20 minutes, he had guided Clara toward a prominent circle of local logistics executives and asset managers. I slowly walked over, stepping into the periphery of their conversation, an unremarkable old man fading into the background. When Clara noticed me, her eyes lit up and she introduced me as her father. Richard's smile shifted instantly. It became tight, practiced, and deeply patronizing. Before I could even offer a handshake, he clapped me on the shoulder, turned to the high-ranking executives, and announced, "Everyone, this is Thomas, Clara's dad. He's a retired railroad line worker, spent his life fixing track ties and working the switches down in the yards. An honest, simple labor guy, but completely lacks any form of business acumen or corporate instinct. Enjoy your prime rib, Tom." The circle offered a few polite, pitying nods, completely dismissing me as a relic of manual labor. Richard then smoothly steered the conversation back to his own MBA accomplishments, leaving me standing on the fringe like a piece of old furniture. I didn't flinch. I smiled politely, took a slow sip of my club soda, and moved along. Here is what Richard Miller thought he knew about the old man standing by the carving station. He thought he was looking at a harmless, blue-collar pensioner who lived on a fixed Social Security check, a social non-entity who could easily walk over while he consolidated his grip on Clara's checklist. But here is the 10% of reality that was entirely blocked out from his calculations. I wasn't just a retired railroad worker. I was the absolute, ultimate owner and sole trustee of Payback, a silent, multi-layered private equity company that possessed a staggering $4.2 billion portfolio, dominating the entire freight distribution, steel manufacturing, and rail track infrastructure across the United States East Coast. Richard was currently celebrating his recent, highly publicized appointment as the CEO of Miller Rail Logistics. What he proudly believed was the result of his own brilliant corporate interview performance was actually a simulation. I had personally orchestrated that entire executive recruitment search behind a wall of anonymous blind trusts. I had personally vetted his psychological profile, reviewed his background checks, and quietly authorized his corporate appointment through my board representatives. I had intentionally placed him into the cockpit of my own subsidiary company as a final, comprehensive character test before I ever dreamed of trusting him with my daughter's future. Richard thought he was a brilliant wolf who had successfully hunted his way into a golden boardroom. He had absolutely no idea he was a test subject inside a massive laboratory completely financed, operated, and owned by the quiet man he had just publicly humiliated. Quiet men are only quiet until they're not. And Richard had just stepped onto a track where the freight train was already accelerating. The illusion of his complete dominance persisted for another 18 months. By autumn 2023, the Boston air had turned sharp and unforgiving. I continued to play my role as the invisible, benign background figure in Clara's life, never offering unsolicited business advice, never driving anything but my weathered green Ford F-150. To Richard, I was just an biological obligation he had to tolerate during holiday dinners. On a Tuesday afternoon in early October, I drove down to the corporate headquarters of Miller Rail Logistics on Atlantic Avenue. I was there under a completely mundane pretext, delivering a signed insurance renewal proxy form as a registered, low-level representative of one of our minor landholding entities. I was dressed in my everyday canvas work jacket, gray utility trousers, and work boots. I looked like a man who had spent his morning working a wrench in a locomotive repair bay, entirely unremarkable to the security guards or the sleek receptionists who barely looked up from their screens as I walked past. After dropping the paperwork with an administrative assistant, I took a wrong turn down the quiet, carpeted corridor leading toward the executive suites on the top floor. As I approached the frosted glass doors of the executive corner office, I heard Richard's voice cutting through the quiet of the hallway. He was talking to two of his newly appointed vice presidents, young corporate climbers with expensive haircuts and identical tailored suits. The door was cracked open about 2 inches. I stopped in the shadow of a large concrete pillar. "Clara's dad?" Richard was saying, followed by a dry, arrogant chuckle that echoed through the room. "The old man is completely harmless. A nice guy, sure, but he peaked 40 years ago turning bolts on track lines. He has absolutely no concept of modern asset velocity or intermodal logistics. He spends his entire week fussing over his backyard potato garden and driving that rusted-out piece of junk truck." I stood completely motionless in the corridor. I didn't break my posture. I didn't reach for the door handle to confront him. I listened as he lowered his voice, though his tone remained dripping with self-satisfaction. "Clara feels an immense sense of daughterly guilt because he lives on a fixed pension, which can be exhausting. But what can you do? Family is family. Once the inheritance structures are legally consolidated, I'm shifting the core freight margins into a private investment holding I've established in the Cayman Islands. By the time the old man even realizes the train has left the station, Ironclad's subsidiary equity will be fully under my control, and he'll be left with nothing but his rocking chair on the porch." The young executives laughed. That practiced, sycophantic corporate laugh designed to flatter a boss. I quietly turned around, walked back down the long corridor, and stepped into the freight elevator. I didn't feel a surge of heat in my chest. I didn't allow my breathing to change. Anger is an inefficient use of kinetic energy. It is the currency of men who operate without a blueprint. I walked out to the gravel parking lot, climbed inside the cab of my Ford F-150, and turned the key. The heavy V8 engine roared to life with a familiar, mechanical growl. I sat there with my hands on the worn leather steering wheel, watching the afternoon sun strike the glass of the executive tower. I pulled out my field notebook, uncapped my pen, and methodically logged the exact timestamps of the conversation, along with the corporate registry numbers of the Cayman entities Richard had inadvertently confirmed. I sat in the idling truck, completely focused, letting the raw reality of his treason integrate into my structural calculations. I gave the silence time to crystallize into a concrete operational strategy. He believed he was secretly tunneling under my house. He had no idea he was merely digging his own grave inside a canyon I already owned. Quiet men are only quiet until they're not, and Richard had just handed me the precise stress points I needed to derail his entire life. The formal invitation arrived on a bleak Thursday evening in early April 2025. Richard called my personal line at exactly 7:14 p.m. His voice carried that synthetic, over-polished warmth he used whenever he was about to ask for a concession while simultaneously slipping a knife between my ribs. "Hey, Tom," he said, the sound of ice clinking against a crystal glass audible in the background. "My parents, Charles and Evelyn, are hosting an intimate family dinner this Saturday at their estate out in Westfield. We'd love for you to join us. It's a big night for the family." Before I could answer, he cleared his throat, shifting his tone into something sharper, layered with calculated condescension. "Look, just as a friendly heads up, Tom. My parents are very traditional New England old school. Status matters to them. It might be worth your time to dig into your closet and find something a bit sharper than your usual attire. No worn-out work jackets, okay? And please, I'm begging you, leave that rusted green Ford truck at home. Take an Uber. We're trying to keep the estate looking pristine for some local magistrates who might drop by later." I sat at my kitchen table, listening to him build a wall of arrogance brick by brick. I knew he expected me to make an excuse, to decline the invitation out of a blue-collar sense of shame that he believed he had successfully beaten into me. But Richard was a man who relied entirely on psychological leverage, and he had saved his true leverage for the end of the call. "Actually, Tom, there's another reason you need to be there," he whispered, pitching his voice to sound entirely genuine. "My mother was clearing out an old safety deposit box from the New England Historical Society last week. She found a leather-bound personal diary that belonged to Martha back in the late 1970s, before you two got married. Evelyn wants to hand it over to you personally over dessert. I know how much Martha's memory means to you." The mention of my late wife's name hung in the cold air of my kitchen. It was a calculated, venomous lie. A psychological manipulation strategy designed to exploit my grief and force me into a room where they could extract my signature on Clara's trust fund waiver. They thought they could use Martha's memory as a tether to drag an old man into their theater of humiliation. I didn't let my breathing change. I didn't let a single trace of emotion enter my voice. "I appreciate you thinking of me, Richard," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and compliant. "Tell your mother I look forward to receiving it. I'll see you at 6 p.m. on Saturday." I hung up the phone and stood up. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom closet. I moved past the tailored, custom-made charcoal suits in the back, the ones I wore when Ironclad Holdings finalized its multi-state rail freight mergers, and reached for my everyday clothes. I pulled out a pair of simple, plain khaki trousers and a faded navy button-down shirt. Clean, pressed, but utterly unremarkable. The exact uniform of a man they believed had peaked 40 years ago. I took my keys, walked out into the cold night air, and stepped into the driveway. I took a clean microfiber cloth from my toolbox and systematically wiped down the glass of the cracked passenger mirror on my 2008 Ford F-150, patting the cold steel of the dark green door panel twice. "Let's go see this aristocratic theater, old girl," I thought as the salt mist rolled in off the coast. "The dress code is humble. We've got that covered." They believed they were setting a trap for a desperate, sentimental old man. They had no idea they had just forced the hand of the chief engineer. The drive out to the Miller estate in Westfield took exactly 42 minutes. I pulled my faded green 2008 Ford F-150 into their sweeping, semicircular gravel driveway at precisely 5:58 p.m. The truck's rusted rear wheel well stood out like a scar against the aggressively manicured boxwood hedges, but I didn't care. I turned off the ignition, adjusted my simple navy button-down shirt, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. Charles Miller, a retired county court judge, opened the heavy mahogany front door himself. He was a tall, silver-haired man wearing an expensive cashmere sweater that screamed casual wealth. His smile was perfectly assembled, an engineered corporate handshake wrapped in New England hospitality. Beside him stood Evelyn, her neck dripping with understated, seven-figure diamonds. She immediately took both of my hands with a suffocating, artificial warmth. "Oh, Thomas, look at you," she murmured, her voice laced with a patronizing sweetness. "Such a sweet, elderly man. Clara told us how much you enjoy your little backyard potato garden. Come inside, out of the cold. We've prepared a lovely, simple evening for you." They escorted me into a formal dining room designed specifically to establish a structural deficit between the hosts and their guests. The massive table was set with heavy sterling silver, antique porcelain, and baccarat crystal glasses that caught the flickering amber glow of imported candles. I took my seat, unfolded my linen napkin, and voluntarily became the invisible man in the room. Richard and Clara sat opposite me. Throughout the main course, Charles dominated the room, speaking with the booming, unchecked authority of a man who spent 30 years watching people tremble beneath his gavel. He lectured the table on macroeconomic asset velocity, zoning ordinances, and what he called the inherent cognitive deficit of the working class. "The problem with men who spend their lives in manual labor, Thomas," Charles said, swirling a vintage Bordeaux in his glass while looking directly through me, "is that they completely lack the intellectual capacity to understand the leverage of modern financial instruments. They view wealth through a microscope, completely blind to the macro topography of the market." I nodded politely, took a small bite of my prime rib, and watched the predator slide into his own trap. The true purpose of the dinner materialized with the dessert course. As the plates were cleared, the polite atmosphere vanished, replaced by the cold, logistical calculation of a corporate hostile takeover. Charles reached into his leather portfolio, pulled out a thick, legal-bound document, and slid it across the polished mahogany table until it rested right next to my water glass. Richard straightened his posture, flashing that arrogant, six-figure CEO smile. "We need to discuss family architecture, Tom," Charles said, his voice dropping into his official courtroom register. "This is a comprehensive post-nuptial trust amendment. It legally structures the permanent transfer of Clara's inheritance management directly into Richard's personal holding entity, serving as the required liquid collateral for his new independent energy venture." I didn't pick up the pen. I slowly turned the pages, reading the precise, predatory clauses. They weren't just asking for a blessing. They were executing an ambush. Charles leaned forward, his eyes turning gray and menacing under the candlelight. "I think it's in your best interest to sign it tonight, Thomas. As a retired judge, I still maintain substantial, unyielding influence over the Norfolk County Zoning Board. I've recently reviewed the deed to your ancestral farm on Birchwood Lane, and it would be a terrible, expensive tragedy if the county suddenly reclassified your land boundaries or initiated a commercial eminent domain audit. Let's keep this professional and keep the family protected. I closed the document with a soft, deliberate thud. I looked across the table at Richard, whose eyes were already frantically counting the money he believed was his, and then at Charles, who thought his old gavel still held power over my life. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow, unhurried sip, and allowed my face to settle into a mask of absolute, unreadable compliance. I had spent 40 years building the very infrastructure they were trying to steal, and they had just handed me the exact legal leverage I needed to strip them of everything they owned. I didn't get mad. I got organized. For the next 14 days, I maintained absolute, unyielding silence. I didn't return Richard's frantic phone calls, nor did I acknowledge the barrage of text messages that arrived on my screen like clockwork every afternoon at 4 p.m. on day 3. His message read, "Hey Tom, hope you had a chance to sign that paperwork from the dinner. We need to move on the energy venture before the quarter closes. Let's protect Clara's future." On day 7, the tone shifted, growing slightly desperate, thinly veiled with arrogance. "Tom, we need that trust amendment back immediately. Don't let your stubbornness get in the way of real business." I ignored every single notification. Instead, I lived my life exactly as I had for the past 34 years on Birchwood Lane. I woke up at 5 a.m., brewed my black coffee, and spent my mornings out in the crisp New England air. On Wednesday afternoon, my neighbor Bill Patterson leaned over the wooden fence, holding a rusted garden trowel. We spent 24 minutes discussing the structural depth of his potato beds and whether the early frost would impact the harvest. To Bill, and to anyone watching from the street, I was just an ordinary old man in a faded canvas jacket, a retired laborer puttering away his final years in total obscurity. But beneath that quiet surface, the tectonic plates of the global supply chain were shifting. On the first night of my silence, at exactly 2:14 a.m., I went down to my basement workshop, unlocked my secure satellite terminal, and placed a call to Vance Sterling. In our circle, they call him the Ledger, a legendary asset protection specialist who spent 35 years dismantling corporate raiders from a nondescript brownstone in Boston. I didn't want a standard corporate audit. A regular financial review would give Richard time to balance his ledgers and fabricate explanations for his board. I wanted a total, irreversible liquidation of his operational oxygen. We activated an economic scorched earth campaign called a liquidity drain. What Richard completely failed to realize when he took the CO position at Miller Rail Logistics was the microscopic engineering of his operational agreements. His company didn't own the physical steel rails, the timber ties, or the high-density switching yards they ran their multi-ton freight trains across. Ironclad Holdings did. 15 years before Richard Miller ever entered my daughter's life, I had personally drafted a standard infrastructure lease agreement containing a heavily penalizing, non-negotiable delay surcharge clause. Last winter, in his haste to look like a visionary leader, Richard had blindly signed off on a massive cross-border freight expansion, routinely delaying cargo turnarounds by an average of 48 minutes per haul. I instructed Vance to retroactively enforce that clause to its maximum legal limit. Overnight, the infrastructure maintenance fees for every single one of Richard's locomotives jumping onto the Atlantic line tripled. We restricted his credit facilities, recalled his short-term operational leases, and blocked his access to our secondary terminals. Simultaneously, we initiated the second phase of the drain. The forensic digital evidence I had captured from his computer drive, the hidden ledgers detailing his systematic siphoning of Miller Rail's profit margins into unauthorized private accounts in the Cayman Islands, was transferred directly into the secure system of the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division in Washington. We didn't just expose a bad corporate executive. We handed federal agents an airtight, multi-million-dollar tax evasion case wrapped in a silver ribbon. Richard thought he was successfully managing a strategic chessboard against a slow, confused old man. He had absolutely no idea that every time his locomotives hit my steel rails, he was pumping financial blood directly into a closed-loop system designed to starve his entire corporate existence. Quiet men are only quiet until they're not, and the weight of the iron was about to crash down on his head. By the second week of October 2024, the liquidity drain had achieved exactly what Vance and I had engineered it to do. Miller Rail Logistics was suffocating. With the infrastructure fees on the Atlantic Railway lines tripled and their short-term operational credit lines frozen by our proxy entities, Richard's corporate accounts were bleeding cash at a rate of $420,000 every single transit cycle. He was desperate. He was reckless. He was a drowning man looking at the horizon for a lifeline, completely blind to the fact that I owned the horizon. Through Vance's multi-layered network, we established a clean, institutional-grade financial intermediary registered in Delaware called Vanguard Meridian Capital. It was structured to look like a high-end private credit fund backed by New England maritime wealth. We let Richard struggle for another 48 hours until his chief financial officer informed him that they would miss payroll by the end of the month. That was when Vanguard Meridian made its move, casually floating an unsolicited proposal to inject $20 million in immediate working capital into Miller Rail Logistics through a structured Small Business Administration commercial loan program. To Richard, it looked like a miracle. To me, it was the final concrete tie on his track. But a $20 million emergency lifeline from an institutional lender never comes without structural parameters. Vance drafted the underwriting agreement with a hidden, razor-sharp operational hook. Because Miller Rail's debt-to-equity ratio had been completely shattered by our artificial infrastructure surcharges, the fund demanded an absolute, non-negotiable, unlimited personal guarantee to secure the capital. This wasn't a standard corporate liability shield. This clause bypassed bankruptcy protections entirely. It mandated that the borrowers pledge their entire personal balance sheets as primary collateral. Every piece of real estate, every liquid investment account, and every protected asset they owned would be directly tied to the performance of the loan. Richard, blinded by his own corporate arrogance and firmly believing that he would soon seize Clara's trust fund to wipe out the debt, didn't hesitate. He convinced his father, Charles, the retired county court judge, to sign on as the primary co-guarantor. Charles, whose entire sense of identity was wrapped around his legal prestige and his sprawling million-dollar estate in Westfield, believed his son was a corporate visionary. He believed they were playing a high-stakes game where they were always meant to win. The closing took place on a rainy Thursday afternoon at the Harvard Club of Boston, a sanctuary of leather chairs, oil paintings, and elite posturing. Richard and Charles sat at a corner table, drinking 20-year-old scotch, treating the foreign proxy from Vanguard Meridian with a patronizing, upper-class warmth. Charles checked his gold fountain pen, smiled at the representative, and signed his name on the line. He pledged his Westfield mansion, his private pension funds, and his elite investment portfolios. Richard signed right beneath him, flashing that confident, six-figure CO grin, completely convinced he had outsmarted the system once again. They shook hands, ordered another round of drinks, and celebrated the $20 million injection that they believed had saved their empire. I sat in my dark green Ford F-150 parked outside the club, watching the rain heavy against the windshield. I received the digital confirmation on my secure terminal at exactly 4:12 p.m. The electronic signatures were locked into our vault. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel a rush of satisfaction. I simply turned the ignition key, listened to the steady, unhurried roar of the V8 engine, and pulled out into the Boston traffic. Charles and Richard thought they had just secured a fortress. They had absolutely no idea they had just personally financed the purchase of the very gallows they were going to stand on. The reckoning arrived on Thursday, June 12, 2025. At exactly 2:54 p.m. the sky over Boston was an oppressive, bruised iron gray, and a freezing Atlantic salt fog had rolled down Atlantic Avenue, swallowing the concrete base of the Miller Rail Logistics headquarters. Richard Miller walked through the glass lobby doors, radiating the manic, untouchable energy of a corporate conqueror. He was checking his gold Rolex, adjusting his tailored Italian silk tie, and flashing his customary six-figure CO smile to the receptionists. He believed he was stepping into the executive boardroom on the 24th floor to finalize the closing signatures for the $20 million Vanguard Meridian emergency loan program. He thought he had outmaneuvered the system, neutralized his infrastructure deficits, and protected his empire. Most importantly, he believed he had left his simple, blue-collar father-in-law buried under a pile of useless zoning codes in Norfolk County. He rode the private elevator up, tapped his gold fountain pen against his palm, and pushed open the heavy double mahogany doors of the boardroom. He expected to find a circle of polite, wealthy Middle Eastern proxy fund managers waiting to shake his hand. Instead, the room was a tomb. Richard froze in the doorway, his arrogant smile dissolving in real time as his corporate confidence hit an invisible wall. Sitting at the absolute head of the massive, polished boardroom table, occupying the primary executive high-back leather chair, was me. I wasn't wearing my faded canvas work jacket or my worn-out work boots. I sat there in a bespoke, shadow-black three-piece Savile Row wool suit, my arms crossed, watching him with the chilling, measured gaze of a chief engineer watching a structural failure occur precisely where he calculated it would. Sitting to my immediate right was Vance, the ledger, Sterling, holding an unlit cigar. Sitting to my left were four men in crisp, dark federal suits, wearing golden, high-density metal shields on their belts that bore the cold typography of the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division. The silence in the boardroom lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. I didn't rush the moment. When you've spent months running a longer con to beat a short one, every tick of the corporate clock is an absolute luxury. I watched the color drain from Richard's face, floor by floor, as the absolute topography of his reality collapsed. Vance Sterling didn't offer a greeting. He picked up a heavy, steel-bound folder exactly 60 pages thick and threw it down onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a loud, hollow thud that echoed against the glass windows overlooking the foggy bay. "Take a seat, Richard," I said, my voice completely flat, calm, and terrifyingly quiet. "The men from Dubai aren't coming." Vanguard Meridian Capital belongs to Ironclad Holdings. Ironclad Holdings belongs to me. The $20 million lifeline you just signed at the Harvard Club wasn't a rescue package. It was a non-recourse debt trap. Richard's hands began to shake violently as he looked from me to the federal agents. I opened the 60-page blueprint of his destruction. Every single transaction you made over the past 8 months on company devices, every dollar of the maritime freight margins you systematically siphoned into your private Cayman accounts, and every single mile of track usage you falsified is documented right here. You thought you were tunneling under my house, Richard, but you were merely digging your own grave inside a canyon I already owned. The ERS agents next to me are here to execute a formal federal asset seizure. You aren't signing a loan today. You are signing a confession. He looked at the board members, neutral. He looked at the lawyers, neutral. Every trace of the predator he thought he was had vanished, leaving nothing but a very young, very terrified man standing on a track where the iron was about to crash down. The air inside the 24th floor boardroom of Miller Rail Logistics felt heavier than a block of untreated locomotive iron. Richard Miller collapsed backward into his executive ergonomic chair, his chest heaving as the absolute finality of the situation crushed his remaining defiance. The frantic, arrogant predator who had clapped my shoulder at the Boston Mixer was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, pale-faced man whose hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his gold fountain pen. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a combination of terror and utter disbelief, trying to reconcile the image of the simple old man in the faded canvas work jacket with the bespoke-suited titan currently occupying the head of his conference table. To Richard, and to his father Charles, I was a non-entity. A retired railroad worker whose only value was the fixed Social Security check they planned to exploit. They believed they could use my late wife's memory as leverage to siphon Clara's inheritance into a private offshore vehicle. But in that suffocating silence, Vance Sterling unsealed the formal execution documents from Ironclad Holdings. "Let's look at the actual topography of your balance sheet." "Richard," Vance said, his deep voice carrying the terrifying weight of a legal anvil. Here was the absolute, crushing 10% of reality that blew their entire corporate defense apart. Richard thought that if the ERS fraud case dismantled Miller Rail Logistics, he could simply declare Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy, shield his personal lifestyle, and walk away to build his independent energy venture using Charles's prestige. He was dead wrong, because the federal forensic audit had fully documented his systematic, intentional siphoning of corporate margins into the Cayman Islands. His actions were reclassified as criminal asset stripping. Under federal maritime and commerce statutes, Miller Rail's corporate bankruptcy protections were instantly and permanently stripped away, entirely dissolved. More brutal still was the fatal anchor they had signed at the Harvard Club of Boston, because Richard and the retired county court judge, Charles Miller, had executed an unlimited personal guarantee to secure the $20 million Vanguard Meridian lifeline. They had completely bypassed any standard personal asset insulation. They hadn't just mortgaged a company. They had signed away their entire lives. Vance slid the official foreclosure mandates across the polished mahogany. Vanguard Meridian is an immediate subsidiary of Ironclad Holdings, Vance announced to the dead room. Due to your immediate default on the infrastructure debt and the criminal asset seizure, Ironclad Holdings has initiated an expedited 48-hour liquidation execution. Richard, your personal accounts, liquid investments, and New York properties are seized. Furthermore, the multi-million-dollar ancestral Miller estate in Westfield, Massachusetts, along with Charles's private judicial pension funds, are now the exclusive, unyielding property of Ironclad Holdings. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. Richard let out a dry, choked sob, burying his face in his trembling hands right in front of the federal agents. The aristocratic facade, the elite New England legacy, the country club memberships. Everything they had constructed their fragile identities around was obliterated in less than 4 minutes. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms flat on the table, looking down at the broken man who had left a wet ring across my late wife's photograph. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show a single micro-expression of anger. You and your father sat at your dinner table and told me that men of manual labor lack macro-financial acumen, I said, my voice completely flat, calm, and chillingly steady. You thought I was an old, senile relic because I choose to live on Birchwood Lane and drive a rusted-out Ford F-150. You thought you were the apex predator running the real world. Richard, look at me. You thought I was washed up. But the very steel on the railway tracks you and your locomotives run across every single day of your life was forged and cast by me. By September 2026, the structural dissolution of Clara's marriage to Richard Miller was entirely, flawlessly finalized. It was a clinical masterpiece of asset insulation, because my legal defense team at Ironclad Holdings had thoroughly documented Richard's systematic corporate embezzlement and tax evasion. The courts completely severed his claims to any family assets. Clara walked away with her identity intact and her entire clean inheritance fully protected, locked behind an impenetrable wall of personal trust accounts that required her authorization alone. The Miller family, on the other hand, experienced a total and irreversible systemic collapse. Stripped of their corporate shields, their credit facilities liquidated, and facing massive federal indictments from the ERS Criminal Investigation Division, they were completely ruined. Charles Miller's sprawling million-dollar estate in Westfield was formally absorbed into the asset portfolio of Ironclad Holdings, and his prestigious judicial pension was permanently attached to federal restitution mandates. Richard and his father were no longer elite figures presiding over New England country clubs. They were broken defendants counting down the days until their formal sentencing hearings in a federal penitentiary. I didn't stay in Boston to watch the smoke clear from the corporate wreckage. I returned to my quiet wooden house on Birchwood Lane in Norfolk County, sitting at the old oak table where the morning sun filtered through the trees. There were no longer any aggressive legal folders on my counter. No arrogant corporate climbers tracking mud onto my porch, and no manipulative text messages buzzing on my phone. The air was crisp and completely still. I sat there in my canvas work shirt, quietly sipping a warm mug of red raspberry tea, watching the frost melt off the hood of my dark green 2008 Ford F-150 out in the driveway. At exactly 11:15 a.m., the front screen door creaked open, and Clara walked into the kitchen. She didn't say a word at first. She simply walked over to my chair, wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, and let out a deep, trembling breath of pure relief. I held onto my daughter for a long moment, feeling the heavy burden she had carried for 3 years finally lift from her shoulders. When she stepped back, her eyes caught something sitting on the center of the wooden table, a heavy, beautifully polished vintage cedar wood box. I had personally retrieved it from the master study of the Westfield mansion during the asset liquidation process, bypassing their lawyers entirely. I pushed the box toward her and opened the lid. Resting inside on a bed of velvet was Martha's original leather-bound personal diary from 1978, completely untouched and perfectly preserved. Clara ran her fingers over her mother's handwriting, a tear spilling down her cheek. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of awe and lingering confusion. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking in the quiet kitchen. "You knew what they were doing to you for months. You knew how they talked about you, how they insulted your life, and how they tried to use Mom's memory to trap us. Why didn't you stop them sooner? Why did you endure that humiliation for so long?" I turned my head slightly, looking through the paned window out toward the distant, gray horizon of the Atlantic Rail Corridor. In the deep quiet of the Norfolk County night, the low, powerful rumble of a massive freight train echoed through the trees, its horn blowing a sharp, absolute note into the dark air as it pulled thousands of tons of cargo along the tracks. Because a 10,000-ton freight train moving at full throttle cannot be stopped by a handbrake. "Clara," I said, my voice completely flat, calm, and resting in absolute certainty. "If you try to derail a predator too early, they simply scatter and rebuild their structures somewhere else. You have to let them accelerate. You have to let them carry their own momentum directly into the stress points you've engineered for them. It takes time to completely neutralize the kinetic energy of an enemy. But once the tracks shift, the crash is absolute." Welcome to Dad's Ultimate Payback. Hit that like button and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, so you never miss another real, raw, and family-centered chronicle. Take care of yourselves out there, keep your eyes on the ledger, and I will see you in the next one.